Have Stephen Jackson here. I think he comes in with a really nice mixed perspective in terms of where he has been. He spent a full career as a university faculty member, and now he's having a second career in the agencies. And I know that for students that I interact with, many students are really interested in things outside of a regular faculty appointment when they get on beyond their PhD or their postdoc. And so I think Stephen might have some interesting insights into the agency and the university both. So feel free to corner him after his talk and ask him specific questions as needed. But I'll let him take off with this. At our next break, Megan pointed out that there is a coffee shop nearby here. So maybe before we start the panel discussion, those who need their fix can sprint over that direction about 200 meters and be at the Bean and Beaker. And some local, if you're not from here, can guide you back.
Right, thanks. Yeah, thanks for inviting me, Laura. And I'll say that I wear many hats these days because I still do science by night. Although I drive a desk by day. And in talking with Lauren yesterday, it became clear that he wants me to wear all my hats. So I think we'll be done by 8. So I want to just start off with a story that illustrates a number of points. So we're here in Flagstaff. We're in the Colorado River Basin. The Colorado River has its headwaters on the west slope of the Rockies in Colorado, the Wind River Mountains in Wyoming, the Uintas in Utah, and the main trunk of Colorado and its tributary, the Green River, flow through the deserts of the high deserts of the Colorado Plateau and then down into the low deserts of the Grand Canyon and through the lower Great Basin. Which is very hot and very dry. So, and this is a river that supplies water to cities outside, both inside and outside the watershed, all the way from Cheyenne, Wyoming, down through Denver and the Front Range cities over here, down to Albuquerque and Santa Fe, and then on around to the Wasatch Valley, and Los Angeles and San Diego. So this is a really important river in the West for water supply. And it's highly vulnerable to climate change just by the simple physics of you increase temperature, the atmosphere gets thirstier, that leads to increased evapotranspiration, which reduces runoff and ultimately reduces discharge. So water managers are really interested in this question of how will global climate change affect the Colorado River? What can we count on? How do we do our water management planning in the coming years, decades, and further? And of course, so this is an important question societally, and it's important scientifically, and so scientists do what they do. They come riding to the rescue with their supercomputers and their models and their data sets and their Bayesian seductions and so forth to try to address this question. And between around 2000 and 2014, there were at least 12 major studies that attempted to take general circulation model input and predict the mid-21st century flow at Lee's Ferry, the boundary between just above the Grand Canyon, the boundary between the upper and lower Colorado basins. So 12 major studies, and the results were highly divergent, all the way from 6% reduction in discharge, which possibly could be in the same study the fairly wide error margin, so it could be as much as an 18% increase, all the way down to a 45% reduction. That's a really, really large cone of uncertainty. And this is all good science. These are good papers. These are some of the best atmospheric scientists and hydrologists and ecohydrologists in the country working on this problem. These are papers that were published in the Science and Nature family of journals, in PNAS, in AGU journals. So it's all good science, but it's highly divergent, and this led the water managers to be very confused. It's like, okay, what do we count on? What's the answer? How are we going to do planning with a cone of uncertainty that's that large? In this particular case, there's a very nice paper done by a bunch of the people who were the authors of many of those studies, who sat down and wrote a paper together that was aimed at trying to address this question of how do we explain this to water managers, and how do we just get our collective scientific brains around the uncertainty, and then reduce that uncertainty down to where we can tell the water managers something they can work with. I won't go into the details, but I'll just mention again that we're simply trying to go from a GCM projection for mid-21st century to a single number, discharge, cubic feet per second at a single place, these vary. But there's no single right answer. There's no single pathway to get there. There are lots of different approaches that one can take. And so what this group did was simply explain it all and try to dissect it apart and explain the sources of uncertainty, the fact that there was no single right answer. There will never be a simple, perfect solution to a highly complex problem. So I use this as an opening illustration to demonstrate, to get across two things. One is that this stuff is really hard and really complex. There are no single perfect models, and there aren't likely to be. And also that when we are working at the boundary between science and decisions, or science and applications, as Tom was just discussing, we're having to, it's a very different kind of dialogue, and how we talk to each other and the kinds of things that we do in our communities as scientists is not necessarily fully and directly portable to our dialogues with managers. And I'll come back to that towards the end of the talk. Question is, do you think ecology is any easier than climatology and hydrology? We're going from a simple physical system to what we're trying to do here, which is explain what species and species populations and communities will be doing, and how they will be responding to climate change. The obvious answer, I think, is no. If you were awake during Tom's talk, I think the answer is clearly no. This is ecology. When we add ecology to climate change as opposed to temperature or hydrology, we unpack a large amount of complexity and uncertainty. Just one other example. Again, just climate modeling is really hard. It's not easy to develop these models, to parameterize them, and to run them, and to interpret the results. But it's still relatively straightforward compared to even simple ecophysiological and biogeochemical outputs. So simply trying to forecast something like global land carbon uptake there are a variety of modeling approaches that can be used for this. And in this 2006 synthesis, you can see that they are highly divergent, going all the way from very high uptake overall to a very large net yield of carbon or translocation of carbon from terrestrial ecosystems to the atmosphere. So, well, okay, this study was done in 2006, so that was relatively early in the game. Climate change ecology is a relatively new science. We've only been doing it for maybe 3 decades at most, and that's maybe a bit generous. So maybe things improve. Same study, same models, after a lot of improvement, 8 years later, and we still have this large range of uncertainty in a relatively straightforward kind of question. And and I think that a lot of the, I mean, there are a lot of reasons for this uncertainty, but a lot of them have to do with some of the kinds of issues that we've been talking about here. What we're seeing with global climate change is something that a couple of sociologists of science back in the early 90s described as post-normal science. That we're in a situation where global change science has high stakes in terms of the decisions. I mean, we're talking about developing science that policymakers all the way from international emissions negotiations and carbon trading and so forth, all the way down to the proximal level of individual unit managers, the kind that Tom has been interacting with and that I interact with a lot, making very place-based, time-specific decisions about how they're going to allocate their resources, what they're going to be doing. And so in all of these cases, the decision stakes are very high. We've got limited time. We've got limited resources to be allocating to management. And at the same time, we've got very high uncertainty. And Fudowitz and Ravitz argued that when, this is not a great graph, but when you have this combination of high fundamental uncertainty and difficulty and high decision stakes, you're in post-normal science, and we need to be thinking about communicating our science and developing our science in a somewhat different way than we have traditionally. For the past, since the Second World War and even before that, the scientific community has been largely, it's been largely a republic with internal dynamics and internal decisions about what the important questions are, what the ways, the rules of engagement are, how we characterize uncertainty, and just how we go about our scientific discussions. And that's been tremendously powerful and productive in generating the kinds of science. That's why we've made just such tremendous advances since the Second World War. But when we are in these situations with high uncertainty and high decision stakes, then where we're having to communicate with the world outside, things are a little bit different, and we have to be particularly cognizant of the uncertainties and particularly sensitive to them and brutally honest both with ourselves and with the stakeholders as we communicate with them. So a few observations, and these are non-controversial, as was pointed out this morning. It's getting hotter out there. We are bending away from the trajectory that we would have been on had we not been dumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. No need to spend a lot of time with that. We're doing a pretty lousy job as a global society in meeting the Paris temperature targets. We need, if we're going to meet the 1.5 degree or even the 2 degree Celsius range of minimizing global temperature increase, we've got to bend these curves pretty soon. And yeah, the current policy trajectory is taking us well beyond that bending point. You know, unless things change really fundamentally and really quickly at a global level, we are, pardon the pun, baking in climate change for a long time. We're baking in global temperature increase. One of the most depressing papers I've seen in the past couple of years is this one by Brown and Caldera from 2017, published in Nature, that suggests that the climate models that we're using in the IPCC assessments may actually underestimate climate system sensitivity to greenhouse gas forcing. In other words, we may be underestimating the overall magnitude of temperature increase. You know, I really hope they're wrong, but so now that I've depressed you a while, let's take a deep breath and do a pleasant interlude in some green forests or off on a rock, and go back to Alexander von Humboldt, who was really the progenitor of what we're doing in this room. The person who really is at the heart or at the origins of ecology, of global change science, of atmospheric sciences, of hydrology. And he said in 1849, "It is the privilege of the curious and active mind of humanity to occasionally drift out of the present and into the darkness of prehistory, to gain a sense of that which cannot yet be clearly discerned." So, and that's kind of what how I've spent much of my career as a paleoecologist. Not, I didn't have a vision anywhere nearly as articulate as this, or even as clear as this when I started out, but I've spent quite a bit of time just looking at the past and trying to draw lessons from it for the present and for the future, looking directly at climate changes of the past and how ecological systems have responded to them in order to figure out what kinds of things might happen off in the future. So a few observations from the paleo record that I'll start off with. We live in a world of change. Here's no, that's not the same blue marble, but that was shown this morning. But we do live on a planet of change. Environmental change happens, and it's always happened, and it always will happen regardless of human activities. This shows the last 66 million years of Earth history. There's been, since the Paleocene, Eocene thermal maximum, there's been a general cooling trend over that time period, culminating about a 1.5 million years ago into this very wobbly period of glacial, interglacial alternations, the Quaternary. And that's blown up here, at least the last 450,000 years are blown up here in this diagram, showing our current interglacial, the last glacial maximum that we were in a mere 20,000 years ago, when ice sheets covered most of Canada and moved on almost to, right up to the Ohio River Valley, and covering much of the Midwest, all of New England and so forth. This is the last interglacial here, the last glacial maximum, and so at least 4 or 5 of these glacial, interglacial cycles. And again, with many more of them, about 20 of them going back to the past 1.5 million years. So this is valuable context, that change happens. We undergo these changes. Some of them, especially the deglaciations, tend to be very steep and very rapid, at least relatively speaking, a few thousand years going from glacial to interglacial. One of the other things I want to point out is that we also spend most of our time not in glacial conditions or in interglacial conditions, but we spend most of our time in kind of a purgatory in between, which is cooler than the current interglacial, a lot cooler. During those periods, there have been large ice sheets on Scandinavia and on the Canadian Shield, but not quite as cool as the last glacial maximum, which was just a few thousand years of extreme ice. So that's important context, a world of change. If we zoom in to just the past 1,000 years or past 1,200 years, again, we see a lot of change. This is a tree ring reconstruction of, and again, unfortunately, the legend is cut off, so it's the past 1,200 years from the upper Colorado River Basin, based on tree ring analyses from the headwaters regions of Wyoming, Colorado, and in Utah, that a number of people, both in the tree ring lab at Tucson, at University of Colorado, in my old lab at Wyoming, developed and composited. This is the instrumental record. The red is the this is the instrumental period. The red is the instrumental record. The black is the tree ring record. These here, we've got about 30-year smoothing on the record, again going back to instrumental, and then the tree rings carry us back to AD or CE 3000 or 800 rather, 1,200 years ago. And one of the things to note is that there is no normal here. This is not random fluctuation around a constant mean. This is non-stationary variation with a great deal of evolution. And there's really no single characteristic period here, or individual period that's representative of the entire time. It's continually evolving with both in terms of the amplitude and the frequency of the wet and dry periods. And this is a really important point that I'll come back to later. This is a manifestation of interactions between the atmospheric system and between atmospheric circulation and ocean circulation, largely in the Pacific Basin, but also with influences and feedbacks from the Atlantic Ocean Basin, and also with some interactions with the cryosphere, with sea ice, and with the land surface. And together those interactions in various cycles, particularly in sea surface temperatures in the tropical and northern Pacific, are what are driving these different kinds of variations. That's ecologically important. I'll come back to that later, but again, just to note that we live on a very dynamic planet. So let's throw in some paleoecology. I'm just going to fling a small number of these diagrams. I could go on for many hours with them, but I won't. This is from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And it represents a sediment core, vertical axis here. So we go deeper in the sediments on the vertical axis, and it's also, of course, a time axis that's been scaled in terms of years before present, going from the present back 8,600 years. So we've got 8,600 years of history. This record is particularly nice because it includes all of the current upland dominant trees of the Upper Peninsula, or of the central Upper Peninsula. They're all represented very nicely in this record in both pollen, in the gray silhouettes, and in plant macrofossils in the black and open bars. One of the nice things about the plant macrofossils is they're very localized. We can identify them as species. The pollen we can't always do that with. One of the things you'll notice, first of all, is that right now this is hemlock, beech, sugar maple, yellow birch forest, mixed conifer hardwoods forest. But one of the forest dominants, Fagus grandifolia, or beech, has only been there for 1,500 years. So in its current configuration, or its pre-European configuration, this is a relatively young community, at least in terms of it was missing one of its major dominants just 1,500 years ago. And then as you go further back in time, you see all of these dominant species increasing or decreasing alternately through time in response largely to climate change. These are some of the declines that we see, not all of them. These are some of the increases. The general point, again, I won't dive into the details, but the general point here is that we've got 8,600 years of forest dynamics during which there's never been a period exceeding maybe 1,500 years during which there was not some major change in the overall forest composition. One of the dominants going down, or more of the dominants going down, and new dominants arising, or formerly dominant species re-arising. So it's a very dynamic system, turning over, largely driven by climate change, but also with a lot of other dynamics and interactions involved that we don't know a whole lot about, except in a few cases. I'll come back to that. So, well, maybe we're up on the ice sheets. That's a little bit, or informally deglaciated terrain. Maybe things get calmer when we go south. Here's a record that will be coming out later this year from the coastal plain of South Carolina. And this record has been a little bit quieter during the late Holocene. There's not a lot of action for the past 4,000 years. It's been along with the pine forest through that entire period. But then when we go into the mid-Holocene, we go into a period with much greater pine dominance, much lower, much greater oak dominance, much lower pine dominance. When we go back to the last glacial maximum, 20,000 years ago, it's very strongly pine dominated, but it's not southern pine, it's jack pine, a boreal species that's the dominant player. And then there's this intermediate period during the last deglaciation when there's a lot of turnover, a lot of species coming, a a lot of tree species coming and then going with the warming, the wetting, and then the drying and continued warming going into the Holocene. This is my final example, just to show some of the diversity of this. This is a pack rat midden series from the Utah-Wyoming border. It's currently dominated by pinions, the same species that Tom has worked with, and in juniper, primarily Juniperus osteosperma. And this is a record of presence-absence of various tree and shrub species over the past 20,000 years in pack rat middens that we dug and cracked and pried out of various caves and crevices in the rocks. Pack rat middens are collected by rodents. They basically develop a little private herbarium of material from the surrounding area, stash them into caves and pee on them, and then the urine crystallizes and preserves the middens for thousands of years. So first of all, here's one of the dominant species, Pinus edulis, the pinion pine, and it's only been there for 750 years. It's a relatively recent occupant, so this is, in its current configuration, a very young ecosystem. The other dominant, Juniperus osteosperma, has been there for about 9,000 years ago, but it was not there during the last glacial maximum or during the last deglaciation. And there are a number of species that were there during the last deglaciation and the last glacial maximum that no longer exist at the site. They have all moved upslope 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet. So again, change. So, and this is what we see all over the globe, particularly, certainly in the Holocene, but almost universally when we go back to the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago. Exceptions to this kind of ecological turnover are rare. This is from, again, it's missing the citation, but this is a paper that was published in Science a couple of weeks ago, and it represents a global synthesis of paleoecological sites that date back to the last glacial maximum. So what we did was get colleagues from all over the world, local and regional experts, to compile the almost 600 sites and then assess the simple questions of, with respect to vegetation composition and structure, how different was last glacial maximum vegetation from today or from the undisturbed late Holocene record? Was it not much? Was it some? Or was it large? And large generally, pretty much massive structural change, at minimum, something like going from evergreen conifer to deciduous forest, or it could be as radical as grassland or tundra to forest. And compositionally, looking at just how much turnover there was in the dominance. As you can see, most places on the globe have undergone moderate to large vegetation change in the terrestrial ecosystems. Only a handful of sites did not change. Oops. And one of the interesting features of this is that the small number of sites where we saw relatively little change tended to be associated with relatively little temperature change on the order of 2 to 3 degrees of local temperature change or regional temperature change. So generally, if temperature changed very much, there was a very high likelihood that the vegetation was going to change a fair amount. And sometimes, even if the temperature difference wasn't that great, still there was a lot of vegetational change. But in general, you didn't see vegetation change only when the temperature change was relatively small. I will come back to this a little bit later. Another thing that we see, another phenomenon that we observe as part of this ecological turnover is emergence and disappearance of ecological communities, of assemblages of species. This is a site from the Ozark Mountains that shows during the last deglaciation, we went from boreal forest of spruce and jack pine to a period between 16 and 13,000 years ago that was basically forests composed of spruce and oak and ash. Spruce, oak, ash forests. You can't really go to January and July average temperatures across North America today in black. The white dots are GCM simulated temperatures. You can see that there's a major displacement of the overall point cloud of these two variables, and it's in the direction of having higher July temperatures and lower January temperatures than today. A much more seasonal climate than we have today. There are climatic reasons that for that that I can talk about more later. But the basic idea here is that the correlation is preserved. These are still positively correlated on geographic gradients. They have to be to obey the physics. But the correlations decouple in time. In other words, the slope and the y-intercept and so forth, the relationships between these two simple variables and many other climate variables do not necessarily covary in time, and they can go in different directions depending on the nature of the climate drivers. And this is what leads to no analog climates that we've documented from the past, and accounts in large part for these no analog communities, these communities with no modern counterparts. So looking forward, in this analysis from 2007, just taking mean January and July temperature and mean January and July precipitation as 4 climate variables, and looking at their multivariate behavior under how those 4 variables change together under the A2 and B1 scenarios available at the time, that over much of the globe, under future climate projections, novel climates would arise over much of the globe, and many existing climates will disappear. So again, we're looking at particular combinations of climate variables. Climate is multivariate, especially when you add biology. And those particular climate realizations are going to change. They're going to come and go, and many realizations out there today are going to vanish, and realizations that do not exist today are going to arise. Niche envelope models, which has been the primary tool applied to this kind of thing, they don't, there are many reasons I can criticize niche envelope models, but this is something that they really have no capacity. They're very poorly supported to deal with these climates. And as a result, of course, novel ecosystems will arise, some ecosystems will vanish. We're already seeing novel climate arise. The current drought in California, looking from the perspective of the past several hundred years, is not exceptional in terms of the precipitation deficit. It has been dry. There has been a precipitation deficit relative to the late 20th century normal in California. But the drought has been much, much, much more severe than previous droughts with similar precipitation deficits. The difference is that California has been experiencing for the past 10 plus years record-breaking temperatures in virtually all of the seasons. And that's the difference. That's why this is a new kind of drought. It's not only fairly dry, but it's also really, really hot, which is an unusual combination. Coming back to this graph, I want to get back to the ecological implications of this. But first of all, talk about one of the climate ones. Even though we might be able to forecast long-term climate trajectories going, say, 2050 or 2100 or 2118 or whatever, we do not have good capacity for forecasting the paths. We are not going to get to 2100 from here by a straight line. What's going to be happening is greenhouse gas forcing and land use forcing are going to be interacting with the natural variability in the climate system or in the Earth system, in the ocean atmosphere cryosphere system, and interacting with this kind of natural variability or with the forcings of this natural variability to make the path very wobbly and uneven and irregular. So it's not going to be a straight line, and we currently don't and may not ever have very robust capacity for forecasting that exact trajectory. And the ecological significance of this is that many ecological outcomes are historically contingent. Ecosystems, particularly terrestrial vegetation, which I work with, has various kinds of inertias. It's got various kinds of legacy effects, various kinds of historical anachronisms. And so climate variability will and already is interacting with disturbance events, fires, pest outbreaks, pathogens, mortality events, and it will interact and is interacting with recruitment to create path-dependent realizations, ecological realizations as a result. There are lots of examples of this in the paleoecological record. I won't go into them in detail, but we see it with a number of colonizations of species in the West and also in the boreal forest in Quebec. We see it with some declines of species in eastern North America. So it's a phenomenon that's fairly well documented in the places where we've been able to put together very good temporally and spatially resolved paleoecological chronologies together with spatially and temporally resolved climate chronologies that get down at the decadal to multi-decadal to centennial variability levels, which is where a lot of the ecological action in tree populations or in forest systems actually occurs. So this is just a summary slide for that. We've got climate change and variability at temporal scales all the way from interannual up to multimillennial. We've got multi-scale spatial heterogeneity in the environment, spatio-temporal ecological processes. We can add genetic variability, which is another very important source of this, which varies in space and time. And you wind up with these complex cross-scale interactions and outcomes that can be highly contingent historically. This is back to the science paper from a couple of weeks ago. So what we did here was we used the past changes between last glacial maximum and present, and the relationship with temperature to model it formally, and just develop an empirical model of how much, what's the likelihood of large vegetational change as a function of temperature change. And we ran it for the best case scenario, probably the best one we could hope for, although we're probably beyond it, the RCP 2.6. And we ran it for RCP 8.5. We also did it for the ones in between. But you can see under RCP 8.5, we're just using this simple model. It's suggesting vegetational transformations across the globe. This is not terribly new, but in terms of, we've already forecast this with models, with empirical observations, and so forth, but it's just bringing another data set, another completely independent approach to the problem and showing that, yes, temperature is a major determinant of vegetation structure and combination, and of course a major determinant of what animals and mycorrhizae and various other organisms are doing. So this was missing the caption. So we're already seeing this kind of thing on the landscape. Tom was just talking about what's happening on the north side of the San Francisco Peaks. This is from the Santa Catalina Mountains just outside Tucson, where the aspen fire of 2003 roared through old growth ponderosa pine forest during a severe drought, during a period of a drought that we're still not out of, and during a period of record-breaking high temperatures. And this is a photo taken 15 years after that fire, and you can see the skeletons of the ponderosa pines, but there's almost no ponderosa regeneration in that area. It's all coming up in Gamble oak and Robidia scrub, which is very persistent. It's not likely to go away anytime soon. So here we're seeing, at very least, a long-term vegetation conversion in both composition and structure. And we're seeing this in places all over the West following these big mortality events that have been going on for the past couple of decades. This goes a little bit into what Tom was talking about, these ecological indeterminacies that can arise from novel environments, novel climates that are arising. These are the three major determinants of community structure in terms of community ecology literature. It's the environment, it's the biotic interactions, it's the neutral assembly kinds of contingent dynamics. And all three of them play a role in determining where species grow and how many of them there are and what they're doing and how well they're doing. All of them are determined by climate. And so, and we, as Tom, I think, so nicely pointed out, we're just starting to scratch the surface of understanding those kinds of interactions and those kinds of dynamics. There's a lot of work to be done there. Just a quick note on, we have documented in the past in the paleo record casualties of climate change, so it happens. We've lost some major species to climate change. We've lost genetic diversity. These are all species that have undergone severe genetic bottlenecks in the not too distant past, so they've had near extinction events. We lost an entire tree species that was both widespread and abundant in the southeast at the last glacial maximum, but by, within a few thousand years it was gone. There are other examples, again, the citation's missing, but this is one that we've only published a general description, but this is a species of spruce from the Central Rockies that's disappeared, that has no modern counterpart. It's probably closest to Picea pungens, but there's some large morphological differences that discriminate it. With ancient DNA becoming available, which has been very widely applied by vertebrate paleontologists, we're finding a lot of genetic turnover and population extinctions and losses of genetic diversity, as well as outright extinctions as a function of climate change. I think aDNA, it's still having a lot of growing pains, but I think ancient DNA offers a lot of potential sources of information. So to move on, despite these biodiversity losses and disruptions, species do abide. And I think it's important to remember that all of the species that we work with today have been through a lot. They've been through a glacial to interglacial transition that included periods of rapid change. So there is a lot of natural resiliency out there. The environment does change, and there is capacity, natural capacity for species to adapt. And the key, of course, is as we turn up the dial, the rate and magnitude of climate change, the big question is, how can species adapt to those changes rapidly enough? This is a diagram from a few years ago that just tried to break this out in terms of, we've done a very good job in the ecological community in measuring exposure. This is what species distribution models do. They measure exposure. What they don't do is tell you much about actual climate sensitivity or about adaptive capacity. And if we're going to use our conservation resources in a smart way, we really need to be able to characterize these because basically, exposure, it just doesn't provide enough information. We don't have enough resources to allocate to translocate every species. So we need to be able to identify the ones where we do need these kinds of interventions and the ones that we can leave alone. And I think that's where this whole RCN can play a really valuable role in helping us understand better these sensitivity and adaptive capacity components. And figure out how to do that well. Tom has already taught, and others have already talked about these natural adaptation capacities. We just need to learn more about them and how to leverage them in our management activities. I'll just move quickly through a few challenges and uncertainties to think about. One is, what are the appropriate climate variables? We've heard a little bit about this today already. What do we mean by temperature? GCMs are good at, what we usually get out at the first level output are mean annual and seasonal temperatures and precipitation. But of course, when we get down to the biology, there are lots of different temperature components that matter to the individual species or individual populations that are out there. And this is just a very superficial breakdown of some of the kinds of more proximal temperature variables that are relevant to species. And of course with animals there are all kinds of different ones. Let's see, I'll skip this one just for lack of time. One of the things, and again I think Tom got at this, but the reality out there is really complex. And so one of the issues out there is how representative is our knowledge of what's really out there that might be happening. So this is the red-picated woodpecker prescribed habitat for its recovery plan, which is based on careful, rigorous studies of RCW habitat in the southeast. In the red circles, and these green dots represent places where the woodpeckers are nesting happily outside the prescribed habitat. And if we blew this up, you'd see a lot of open circles inside the prescribed habitat. So the woodpeckers did not read the prescribed habitat plan. They did not read the management plan. They're doing their own thing. And right now, under the current